My last avatar video that I did, I was talking about avatars and relationships. And this was primarily focused on relationships with the original inhabitants of the Earth, the beings who were in embodiment when we first came to Earth as avatars. And I said then that I would do another video where it focused on avatars and our relationship to fallen beings. And I explained what fallen beings are in my other avatar videos, but also in my video about how the world was created. So you need to have an understanding of fallen beings before you watch this video, because it'll be too much to go into that whole explanation again. So, but basically what I will say here is that there was a point where the Ascended Masters decided, and I've explained that in other videos why they decided this, to allow fallen beings to embody on Earth. And there was asked on natural planets, which I also explained in the other avatar videos what that is, if there were beings who would volunteer to take embodiment on Earth to hold a balance for the fallen beings so they couldn't take the Earth into a destructive spiral and destroy the planet. And those of us who are avatars who came to Earth, we volunteered. And what has happened to us since then is, as I also explained in the other videos, that we have been involved with fallen beings, often from our first embodiment here. And this is something that, of course, we weren't brought up with. We don't have any idea from our upbringing that there are even fallen beings, that they exist. And you might ask why. And the reason for this is that the fallen beings have systematically, for many thousands of years since they first came to Earth, they have done everything they could to hide themselves, to camouflage themselves, so that nobody really knows and nobody really understands what they are, what kind of beings they are. But of course, we came partly to hold a spiritual balance. And the result of this is that often in our first embodiment, we embodied along with fallen beings. And this means that, well, it means two things. First of all, the fallen beings often deliberately attacked us because they wanted to, basically they wanted to destroy our ability to threaten their control of Earth. And in order to do this, they were willing to destroy us psychologically, spiritually. And so this was often their goal. So they often attempted to do this, which is why we got what I in other videos are called the cosmic burst trauma, which we received from the fallen beings. And but this also means that our encounter with the fallen beings, we can't necessarily say that it was always this enormous trauma. It's a little bit different from different people. But it was always a very significant encounter. And part of it was that we could not understand how the fallen beings could do what they are doing, not just to us, but to the original inhabitants of the Earth and to each other, because the fallen beings are often at war with each other. So you have to look at our situation. You know, we came to Earth from having embodied for a long time on a natural planet. And on a natural planet, people treat each other according to the golden rule. Do unto others. Because you have a certain basic humanity that makes you see that all people are equal. There's none that are special, none that are better than others, none that are subhumans. So you treat other people well. You have a certain sense of connection with other people. So you realize that if you harm somebody else, you're really harming yourself, and who's stupid enough to harm themselves? Certainly not an avatar. So therefore we are used to, this is how you treat others. So here we are, we come to Earth, and we first of all observe that, you know, the ordinary inhabitants of the Earth, the original inhabitants, they're not treating each other always according to the golden rule. But then we become aware very quickly that there's a certain group of people, a certain elite, a certain power elite, we might call it, that are really not following the golden rule. They are actually deliberately, viciously, consciously violating the golden rule by seeking to control others and to destroy anybody who will not be controlled. And so this is an enormous contrast for us as avatars, because on a natural planet, nobody's seeking to control others. Many of us who were avatars who volunteered to come here, it was because we had taken advantage of the path that was offered on our specific natural planet. So we had risen to higher levels. Often we start out, when you start out on a natural planet, start being focused on ourselves and our own growth. But then there comes a point where we've taken that as far as we can take it. Now we start focusing on helping others. And it can be directly in a family, it can be in a local society, but gradually we work our way up to a larger context of helping others, being leaders, or even on a planetary level, being leaders on a planetary level, seeking to help everyone grow. So we are used to being leaders on a natural planet, but we are not leaders who want to control. Our leadership was not based on control, but based on service. This is why you have this idea that's somewhat popular out there, servant leadership. That's what you have on a natural planet. And that's what we took with us. But the fallen beings, they will have nothing to do with servant leadership. Meaning they might pretend to be servant leaders, but in their own minds, their leadership is based on a sense of superiority. And, it's not necessarily that, you can't necessarily say that all leaders are fallen beings and all fallen beings are leaders, because fallen beings have created, very intense karma. So they're not always leaders, but they often strive, if they can, for leadership positions. And many, when you look back at history, many of the leaders we have seen in history have been fallen beings. And, Jesus said 2,000 years ago, on their fruits ye shall know them. And one way to look at fallen beings as leaders is their willingness to kill or destroy those who will not be controlled. They always want to control. If they can't control, they are willing to kill large numbers of people. And they have absolutely no compunctions about it. They have no empathy. This is, there's in later years, there's been a very big awareness created around narcissists. And one of the defining characteristics of a narcissist, they don't have empathy. And really, this whole talk about narcissists, it can really be traced back to fallen beings, because the fallen beings are the original narcissists. And so you can, if you want to understand more about fallen beings, look at some of these videos that are on YouTube or read books about narcissists, and you will get some good ideas and insights there. But what I wanted to get to here is that as avatars, it's extremely important for us when we become aware that we are avatars. It's extremely important for us to become aware of our relationship with fallen beings, how we look at fallen beings, how we relate to them. Because we can't actually, number one, move on from Earth. We can't ascend from Earth if we are still having these attachments to fallen beings. And we can't even really fulfill our reason for being on Earth if we are involved with these fallen beings. So it's really important for us to consider this. And I'm not going to be able to cover it all in this video, but I can at least get started on it. And so what happens is that here we come to Earth for the first time. We are innocent because we come here with the best of intentions. We are hoping we can help people because before we came to Earth, we saw that people on Earth are suffering. And naturally, as leaders on leaders on a natural planet, we're not used to people suffering, because on a natural planet, people are really not suffering. So we have compassion, we have empathy for the people who are suffering, and we want to help them overcome suffering. That's often our outer motivation for coming to Earth. So we come to Earth, and as I've said before, the first thing we encounter is that the original inhabitants of the Earth, they don't want to listen to us. We can have all kinds of good suggestions of how they can escape suffering. They don't want to listen to us, most of them. So we feel ignored and rejected. But that's one thing. I mean, at least they are mostly ignoring us. But the fallen beings are not ignoring us, because the fallen beings see us as a threat. As I said before, not necessarily the ones who are in embodiment who don't understand that they are fallen beings and who we are, and that we are avatars and all this. But the fallen beings in the identity and mental levels, they see us as a threat to their control over the Earth. So they start this deliberate campaign to destroy us. And this means they attack us. And so now we are experiencing something we have never experienced on a natural planet. We are deliberately and viciously being attacked. And it's not, it's not that they are just trying to kill us. Because they know that killing our body is just one lifetime. We'll reincarnate and here we will be again and be a threat. No, they want to destroy us psychologically and spiritually, so that we come to deny what we are here for. We feel we are not worthy to hold a spiritual balance for the fallen beings. We are not worthy to challenge the fallen beings, challenge their lies and illusions, expose their lies and illusions. And we are not worthy to do something positive for the people. We should basically just crawl into a hole and die, or pretend to be dead. That's what the fallen beings want us to do. That's their goal, to destroy us. Psychologically, spiritually, make us feel worthless, useless. And in order to do this, they're trying to involve us in these schemes where we feel we have done something so bad, epically wrong. For example, and really a good place to start if this is new to you is the book, I've talked about it before, My Lives with Lucifer, Satan, Hitler, and Jesus. Easy title to remember, right? It's written in a first person, but it's not about me, even though I was the one who wrote it. It's really meant to be a story that all avatars can identify with. There's something in that book that you can identify with, and part of it is the relationship with fallen beings and how we have been treated by fallen beings. Because they try to pull us into this scheme where they are causing the downfall of a civilization and millions of people dying, but they make it seem like it was our fault. We could have prevented it, and we didn't. And this often ties in with the attitude we have when we came to Earth. Because we, as I said, we saw the suffering, but the suffering was there before the fallen beings had come. And we felt compassion for the suffering, we wanted to relieve that suffering. But now when we are in embodiment and we experience that the fallen beings are intensifying, magnifying the suffering of people on Earth by creating wars and conflicts and torture and all of this kind of stuff. And we can very easily, especially when we are attacked by the fallen beings, come to feel we should have been able to prevent this. And this is an illusion, okay? This is a dangerous illusion for an avatar. Because we are here to hold a spiritual balance so that the fallen beings can't destroy the planet. But we are not here to prevent them from creating upheaval. Remember what I've said in these previous videos, why the fallen beings were allowed to come here? Because the Earth was in a self-destructive spiral, downward spiral, because of conformity. Nobody dared to be creative. They were all just following rules. So the fallen beings were sent here to break up that conformity. And one of the ways they do is to create this upheaval, chaos, murder, mayhem, war, and all this stuff. I'm not saying the masters want this, but this is just what fallen beings do. And so this is what we call the school of hard knocks. And the fallen beings are happy to give the original inhabitants the hard knocks. And we, as avatars, are not here to prevent the original inhabitants from getting the hard knocks that can awaken them from their hibernation. Spiritual hibernation, spiritual coma. We're not here to prevent this. We're here to prevent that the fallen beings create this downward spiral that destroys the planet. And so far, as you can see, we have been successful in doing that. So we really have nothing to feel guilty about. The other thing is, how can the fallen beings create warfare on Earth, for example? Well, only if they get many among the original inhabitants to support them. So the fallen beings, there's not just one fallen being, they're in the duality consciousness, and I have to explain, there are always two polarities. So there's one fallen being who sets himself up as a leader, there's another fallen being who sets himself up as a leader, and they can't agree, they clash, they can't cooperate. So this leads to a battle, and they pull the original inhabitants into supporting them, both factions, and that's how they create war. These are the choices made by the original inhabitants. We are not here to prevent them from making these choices, because we are not here to circumvent the law of free will. We are here to allow the fallen beings to pull the original inhabitants into following them, blindly obeying them, supporting them, so they can have the experience of that. Now, we can sometimes provide an alternative view, an alternative viewpoint or worldview, but it's just a matter of whether the people choose it or not. And in many cases, what we experienced in past lives was that we did attempt to provide an alternative to the polarized view of the fallen beings, but the inhabitants chose to follow the fallen beings rather than to follow us. That's not our responsibility. We cannot allow ourselves to feel responsible for this. However, it's very understandable that we feel responsible because we didn't know at the time. As I have also explained, in order to take embodiment on Earth, we have to descend to the 48th level of consciousness. In other words, I explained in several videos, there are 144 levels of consciousness possible on planet Earth. Now, as avatars, before we came to Earth, we were at a much higher level of consciousness on our natural planets than what's possible on this unnatural planet. So the 144th level of consciousness on Earth is the highest level possible on Earth. But as avatars, we were beyond that. We were at a higher level. But still, in order to take embodiment, we had to descend to the 48th level. This means that we first start at the 144th level on Earth. There's a certain illusion that you need to overcome in order to rise and ascend. So we first take on that illusion. Then on the 143rd level, there's another illusion. We have to take that on too. And we have to keep taking on these illusions until we get down to the 48th level. And that means at the 48th level, we are not at the same level of consciousness as we were on a natural planet. And therefore, it's not expected of us. The Ascended Masters don't expect that we could prevent the fallen beings from creating murder and mayhem. And you have to realize as an avatar, you have to, if you want to be free of this dynamic, you have to realize how the law of free will works. On an unnatural planet like this, the law of free will works completely individually. You are 100% responsible for your own choices. But you are 100% not responsible for my choices or the choices of anybody else on the planet. You understand? It took me a very long time, probably years, to really integrate this, really accept this. Because it was so ingrained in me as an avatar. I felt responsible for helping people. If I couldn't, I was the one who was deficient, and I needed to prove myself I could help people. It's really important as an avatar to work on this and get to the point where we can see that it was very understandable. We came to Earth, we descended to the 48th level, and we reacted to this birth trauma based on the 48th level of consciousness. And therefore we created these subconscious selves that we often have dragged with us to this day, And we felt responsible. We felt we should have been able to prevent this. But this was based on the level of consciousness we had at the time. And if you're watching this video, you have risen quite far above the 48th level. Otherwise, you wouldn't even be able to watch it. And that means you should not feel responsible today for the choices you made at the 48th level of consciousness. But you will not be free of those choices, or rather the separate selves you created, until you see the selves, see the illusion that caused you to create the self, and dismiss it as the illusion it is. Because you have, as I said, contacted the one mind, the Christ mind, and seen the illusion. So we take on an illusion for each step we go down, but there is also an aspect of the one mind, the Christ consciousness, that can help us see through that illusion, rise to the next step up. But see, you can still have created certain separate selves at the 48th level of consciousness that you have kept with you in your subconscious mind, even though you have risen in general above the 48th level. So it's important to understand they're kind of like two parallel processes. There's your general level of consciousness where you can ascend up and down on the scale. But you can still ascend on the scale, at least to a certain point, while dragging some of these subconscious selves with you that you created at a lower level. You haven't resolved them yet. So it's important to be aware of this dynamic and realize that it was perfectly unavoidable, perfectly understandable, that we descended at the 48th level in order to take embodiment for the first time. We were exposed to this birth trauma. We were exposed to just the trauma of being on Earth and experience what kind of a chaotic planet it is, and especially experiencing the mayhem that the fallen beings created. It's very understandable you created these subconscious selves, probably a number of them, in order to deal with this, in order to survive psychologically. See, it may be helpful to consider here. I'm talking about traumas, I'm talking about subconscious selves we created that are limiting us. But you have to realize, and this took me a while to realize this, but you have to realize that a subconscious self is actually created for a reason, and it actually serves a certain purpose. Because what the fallen beings are trying to do, as I said, is destroy us. And how do they destroy us? They destroy us by trying to create a division in our minds. Jesus said it 2,000 years ago, a house divided against itself cannot stand. A psyche divided against itself cannot stand up to the fallen beings. So, and of course they can only do this by creating separate selves. And they try to get us to create these divisions by exposing us to this trauma that's unbearable. But when we experience something that's unbearable, we are not necessarily acknowledging that this was unbearable. Because we create the subconscious selves, and the subconscious self, we are creating a self that says, I never want to experience this again. And this means the subconscious self is covering over what happened and what we felt about it. And this, in essence, at a certain lower level of consciousness, it acts as a protection from the division, from the trauma, from being, instead of us being torn apart, we can maintain a certain unity in our consciousness, in our souls, because we're covering over the trauma with some subconscious selves. I know this is a little tricky to understand. It may take a little while to understand it, but you understand that what the fallen beings ideally would like to do was to split us apart, literally tear our souls apart, tear our four lower bodies apart. And the only way to avoid this is to cover over the trauma by these subconscious selves. And these subconscious selves are, in a sense, beneficial because they prevent the greater trauma, the greater division. But of course, in the long run, they also limit us because we constantly have to uphold that illusion they're based on. And we, of course, can't ascend with them. And we can't fulfill our divine plans as long as we have these traumas. So, as we grow on the spiritual path as avatars, there comes a point where we're not going to go beyond a certain point unless we look at those subconscious selves that are suppressing the trauma. We are willing to let them die and then look at the trauma that they're covering over. And see that the trauma, as I said, yes, we were exposed to a very dramatic outer situation. But that situation happened a long time ago. I mean, in the book, My Lives, it talks about 2 million years ago from many avatars we came to Earth. So we had many, many embodiments. So this is a very, very long time we were exposed to this initial birth trauma. And there was an actual situation, but what is affecting us today is not the actual situation. It happened, 2 million years ago, right? Nobody knows that there was even life on Earth 2 million years ago. It doesn't affect us. The actual situation doesn't affect us anymore. The only thing that can affect us is what we carry with us in our own four lower bodies, the trauma, the subconscious selves. So, those subconscious selves were created when we were at a lower level of consciousness, the 48th level. It was understandable that we reacted the way we did at the 48th level to this situation. But today we have risen to a higher level of consciousness. And we would not have reacted that way to the same situation. And therefore, when we are at the time, where we need to do this, in order to grow, we need to look at this trauma. We are able to deal with the trauma by looking at it from our present level of consciousness. When we go back, look at the trauma from our present level of consciousness, we can see we would have responded very differently today. You understand what is the effect of being at a certain level of consciousness? It's like you have a certain perception filter. So at the 48th level, you're exposed to a certain outer situation. And at the 48th level, your level of consciousness is a perception filter. So you can only see one way to react to the situation. And that's why you react. And that's why you create this trauma. But today that you are on a much higher level of consciousness, you can see there are other ways to react, and therefore you can deal with the trauma, you can resolve it. Again, it helps, as I've talked about before, first give the decrees and invocations to the Ascended Master to dissolve the emotional energy, and then ask for their help also to see the trauma. And in the book, as I've talked about before, the book Healing Your Spiritual Traumas, there's a systematic method given by Mother Mary for going back in time to that original birth trauma. It's a whole meditation she takes us through, and it can be very, very effective. I have used it very effectively myself, and I know many other people who have done it. So you can definitely deal with this. And what my main message in this video, because I realize I'm probably going to have to do more than one about fallen beings, but is that whatever trauma that the fallen beings exposed you to in a past life, you can overcome it in this lifetime. Otherwise, you wouldn't even be listening to this. If you weren't ready, you wouldn't have been able to listen to this. So, this is the first thing we need to realize about fallen beings, because the fallen beings wanted to destroy us. And as long as we are carrying these cells with us, they haven't destroyed us, but they have prevented us from expressing our highest potential on Earth, from fulfilling really our divine plan. And so if we want to overcome that and fulfill our highest potential in this lifetime, we need to deal with the trauma and overcome it. It's not easy, it's not an instant process, but it is extremely liberating when you get free of this. I described this in some of my other videos. I came to this point. One of the first times I really felt a breakthrough based on these teachings was when I realized there's nothing I have to do on Earth, because I felt there were things I had to do. And that put me in this constant state of tension. So it's really liberating. And whatever it is for you, what your individual birth trauma is, it also puts you in this constant state of tension. Because you have a tension about being on Earth, but you're still on Earth. And you can't get away. You can't get out of this darn body that you're in. And so resolving that trauma, overcoming that tension is enormously liberating. Now, just to at least get started on this topic of how we look at fallen beings, right? So I said, we come from a natural planet. There are no fallen beings there. Now we encounter these beings. And we are shocked by the fact that, first of all, they have this complete insensitivity to other people and to the consequences of their actions. It's like, if we had done something that really caused suffering for other people, we would be mortified. But they're not. They don't care. It just brushes right over. It's like water on a goose. Water off a duck's back. We say water off a goose in Denmark. But anyway, so this is the first thing. We can't understand this. But then we see that they have this really unlimited willingness to destroy other people. And we just can't understand, where does this come from? And in the book, My Lives, with Lucifer, Satan, Hitler, and Jesus, there's talk about two different groups of fallen beings. And there are some that want to control. They have a deliberate agenda. They want to control. But there are others that just want to destroy, because they feel a sense of power from destroying. The first group feels a sense of empowerment by controlling others. The second group feels a sense of empowerment by just destroying what others have built. Anything constructive, they want to destroy. And this is what we can't grasp. How could you want to destroy? How could you want to control so badly you're willing to destroy other people in order to achieve that power? You just can't get it. So, our first reaction to fallen beings is this enormous question mark in our minds. Enormous question mark. How is this possible? Where did these beings come from? How are they thinking? How can they be thinking this? And we just can't get it. And this is what can be really, really tricky for us. Because what are we used to from a natural planet? We are used to increasing our co-creative abilities. How do we increase our co-creative abilities? Well, partly by coming to understand how the world works, right? The Ascended Masters created the entire world of form, and they use certain design principles. And the more we understand about these design principles, the better we are at co-creating. So we see that we improve ourselves partly, not only, but also by opening ourselves up to a flow of energy from above, but partly by understanding how the world works. So here we are encountering these fallen beings, and our first reaction is, I have to understand where these people come from and how they're thinking, why they are the way they are. Because if I can understand them, maybe I can help them so they won't be as destructive. And again, we feel responsible for helping other people. That's what we did on a natural planet. If somebody had a problem, we tried to help them understand better so they could get in a positive spiral. And so here we see the fallen beings are in a negative spiral, and we are thinking, well, if I could just understand them, I could probably help them get out of it, because surely they don't want to be in this. They're suffering. We see them suffering. Right? We see that compared to what we're used to from a natural planet, even though we don't remember it in details, but we come here with a sense that suffering isn't natural, suffering isn't necessary. And we can very well, because you've got to realize, when we come to Earth, we descend to the 48th level, yes, but we still have certain inner senses of, and we have the sense that we are not suffering by being on Earth. Until we receive this birth trauma, we're not actually suffering. So we see that the original inhabitants are suffering, we see that the fallen beings are suffering, and we know it's not necessary. So naturally we want to help people not suffer. And this desire to understand the fallen beings is the main factor that ties us to fallen beings. Because when we are exposed to the fallen beings and what they do to us, we create these subconscious selves. And as I said, as long as we have these subconscious selves, we can't ascend from Earth. And we can't really fulfill our highest potential for being here. So we create these subconscious selves that it can be different for each one, exactly what the decision is, but it's basically saying, I must understand the fallen beings. I mean, we don't call them fallen beings, but I must understand these beings. I've got to understand them. And this means that we actually want to, even though they've hurt us, we want to embody with them in coming lifetimes. And many times, many avatars, we have embodied with fallen beings, sometimes with the same fallen beings, for lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. Because we think, yeah, but I understand them a little better now, and in the next lifetime, maybe I'll understand them. And so by doing this, we are tying ourselves. I mean, I won't necessarily say karmically, although, yeah, in a sense, it's also karmic, but we are tying ourselves to the fallen beings. And in My Life's book, it's actually described how the protagonist first encountered a fallen being called Lucifer and wanted to understand him, and then after some lifetimes of trying to understand him, he switched into wanting to stop him from doing evil. So many of us have had this period. We're probably not in it now, we're spiritual people, but we have had this period where we have been fighting the fallen beings, opposing the fallen beings, trying to stop them, prevent them from creating suffering. And so this is often the period we go into. We're still driven by a certain desire to understand them, but we've realized there's some things we can't really understand, but we can at least stop them from being so destructive. And this often means we fight them physically for a time. And of course, this creates karma with the fallen beings, because now we are taking action. Sometimes we kill them. Sometimes we set ourselves up as leaders on one side and as a fallen being on the other side, and we wage war with them, and thousands of people are killed, and so forth and so on. So all kinds of karmic things that can happen there. But most of us who are spiritual people have probably started, we have transmuted some of that karma in past lifetimes by doing what Jesus and the Buddha have told us to do, not fight the fallen beings, but turn the other cheek, and thereby bring the judgment of Christ upon them when they attack us. So, but still we can have this desire to understand them. And often along with the desire to understand goes this desire to help them, to reform them, to save them. And nothing is more dangerous for an avatar than the desire to save a fallen being. Nothing is more dangerous. I mean, I know I have generally tried to put on a very positive attitude to spirituality and spiritual growth. But when it comes to fallen beings, this is pretty serious stuff. I mean, it really is beings who have this deliberate intention to destroy us. And we cannot persuade them to not do this. We have tried. Most of us have tried in past lifetimes. And there just comes a point where you have to realize you cannot persuade them. You cannot convince them. You cannot reason with them. I don't know if you've ever had this experience. When I was 12 years old, I got a newspaper route. And I was going around in this residential neighborhood with villas and handing in newspapers. And sometimes I had to go up to the house. They had a little slot in the door. I had to put the newspaper through. But others had a mailbox out by the road. So on my very first day of delivering these newspapers, I'm walking, I'm just in my own thoughts. I've already spent half an hour distributing newspapers. And I come up to this house, there's a big hedge. I come up to this house and there's a mailbox out by the road. I think, oh, that's easy. So as I start putting newspaper in, all of a sudden this dog, this big dog came running out towards me, barking and snarling like crazy. And this is the first time I'm encountering it. So I'm just standing there. I'm pretty much petrified. Here, this huge dog, bare teeth, and and then at the last minute before it reached me, boom, and it was stopped by this chain, because the owner, of course, knew what the dog was. Well, the dog was, it was on a chain, but I didn't know that. I thought in a second it was going to jump me, And I was standing there with my bicycle, so I really didn't have a lot of options for getting out of the way. So anyway, I walked around this neighborhood 6 days a week for 4 years. Every single day, this dog would do the same thing. It would come running at me until it was stopped by the chain. Every day for 4 years. And I sometimes try to talk to the dog, because I'm reasonably good with dogs. You talk to him a certain tone of voice and you can get him to listen to you. This dog couldn't get anywhere. 4 years, no change. This is the fallen beings. You can't reason with them, can't talk to them. However, there's a twist. They're not quite like the dog, because they are smart enough that they will pretend they are listening. They will even let you believe that perhaps you could persuade them, perhaps you could reform them, perhaps you could save them. But they do this not out of any sincere desire to change, but just to tie you to them, to tie you into their schemes, to steal your energy and your attention. And this is what we have to start seeing through. And if you're open to this teaching, if you have listened to my avatar videos, you probably already have started seeing through it. I know I certainly had my whole lifetime, but it was not really until I got these teachings about the avatars and about fallen beings that it really started clicking in my conscious mind, and I started seeing the big picture. And I started seeing that I'd actually met certain people that, I can't say for sure that they were fallen beings, but they certainly acted like it. I had seen it on the world stage because I'd always been observing. As I said, I grew up in Denmark, so Hitler was the big bad guy. Once I had the teachings about fallen beings, I realized Hitler was a fallen being. That's why nobody could reason with him, because he always thought he was right. So how can you reason with somebody who believes they know better than you do? And so I started seeing this on the world scale, but I also started seeing that I had actually encountered certain people that I had personal relationships with that also had these same characteristics, that you couldn't reason with them. I mean, you could talk to them, but in the end, you could never get anywhere. It was almost like, I don't know how to explain this really. It's almost like, when I think back at my life, I can see that I always had a willingness to change. I always had a willingness to look at myself and look for, hoping to see something on how I needed to change. And then when I saw it, I was willing to change. But the fallen beings don't have that. They're not willing to change. They can sometimes pretend that they are if they feel that gets you somewhere with you. But they're not actually willing to change. It's just like the dog who kept barking and running for 4 years. You'd think it would get tired of it. But the fallen beings don't. They're not willing to change. And this is what, as an avatar, it can be the biggest surprise, the shock about fallen beings. Because, again, we come from a natural planet. How did we get to being leaders on a natural planet? Always wanting to improve ourselves, always wanting to transcend ourselves, do better, learn better, understand more. Right? So this is our modus operandi. This is our whole attitude to life. And we see that the fallen beings don't have it, and we can't grasp, we can't understand how they can not have it. And so these are really some very shocking things we have. And again, I realize it's already been a long video and I can't cover it all, so I'm going to have to do at least one more on fallen beings. But at least you can start thinking about this. Have you met people in your life where you sense that there isn't that same willingness to change. They're not willing to look at themselves. And if you suggest that they should, they get very defensive and they'll start attacking you instead. You may also have seen people who, at a certain surface level, they seem willing to change, because what you actually find in spiritual movements, you find some people that are seemingly willing to change. But then when you get to know them a little better, you realize there's a certain core of their psychology that they're not willing to look at all. And you can just start, observing this and see whether you've had your own questions about people that you couldn't understand. Why people behave the way they do, why they treat other people like they do. And maybe you've also looked at world figures and couldn't understand how they could be so completely insensitive to the suffering they cause. And then you can at least start maybe seeing, what is it in you? What is it in you that you are hoping you can do for these kind of people? Are you hoping you can persuade them with arguments, with spiritual teachings, for example? Are you hoping you can help them see the need for change? Are you hoping you can reform them, change them, or even save them? And if you identify that, you can start looking at it. And as I said again, the My Lives book, really a good book to start with if you haven't read it, because it helps you also go through this process. And then I'll come back with another video. I'll talk more about this dynamic that we can have with the fallen beings and how to free ourselves from it. But the first step really is to look at, how do you look at these kind of people and what would you like to do for them? Because it's in having something you want to do for others that you tie yourself to them. And as I said, if the fallen beings don't want to change, so if you are tying yourself to them by hoping you can change them, you could be tied to them for a very long time. And the question really is, how much longer do you want to be tied to these fallen beings? That's really the question we have to ask ourselves at a certain point. And then we have to say, if we don't want to be tied to them indefinitely into the future and many future embodiments on Earth, in other words, you could say, how many future embodiments do I want to have on this planet? And you realize in order to ascend as an avatar, you have to free yourselves from any ties to the fallen beings. So perhaps it's time to really look at that and say, okay, what do I have to do to be free of these fallen beings? So that's what we'll talk about in the next video.